Welcome back to the Goldmark Gallery for another exhibition walkthrough. This time we have the fantastic work of Graham Sutherland in our downstairs gallery. It's been quite a long time since we've given a dedicated show to Sutherland. He's an artist whose works we have long held here at the gallery, an artist we've really championed over the years, but it's been a while since our last dedicated show to his work. So some very interesting print works here in this exhibition. Ranging from images that are definitive of Sutherland's work, things like thorn crosses here behind my shoulder, to some prints that many of you will probably never have seen before, from tiny editions like this very rare biomorphic form here. Part of the purpose of this exhibition is to help launch our new print for the Coventry Cathedral. That's our new print reproducing Sutherland's third and final gouache design for the monumental tapestry that hangs at the back of Coventry Cathedral. That's available now for purchase here at the gallery. £200 from every sale goes directly to the cathedral, and there should be a video describing more in detail about that print and the history of the tapestry. Check out a link down here in the description for that video. But for now, let's stick with this exhibition. Graham Sutherland was a hugely significant artist in the 20th century. He was from the sort of the pre-war period, the late 1930s through to the 1960s, 70s, probably one of the most famous British artists alive working in the country. His life, his career didn't follow a standard trajectory. He was not sort of fated from a young age to be the monumentally famous artist that he would become. And he's an interesting case study because he was an artist who found fame and success and fortune in a number of different ways of working. He was very famously a portrait painter. His portrait painting of Sir Winston Churchill, which was famously destroyed by his wife, who disliked it so much, was the centre of a great furore. It was one of the high, or rather low points of his career. He was also very prominently an artist who worked in a religious theme. He was a converted Catholic, and much of his work carries a sort of a sense of private faith. And that's partly why he was commissioned for his work for Coventry Cathedral. The work we're going to see in this exhibition is primarily prints from the period after the war. He was very famously a war artist who stayed in Britain and was sent to the many quarries, the mining sites, the steel furnaces, to document them, to capture some of the feeling of what it was like for the workers in these hugely difficult, hugely hot, intense situations. But the work we're going to see today is from a period after that time. It was in the 50s, the 60s, when Graham Sutherland returned to printmaking. He's one of the major British artists who saw printmaking as an equal art to painting, to the many other things that he did, and dedicated his time to working specifically in the fields of etching, of lithography. So some really special prints here on show. The really fascinating thing about Sutherland, and I think one of the things that makes him such a difficult artist to take in, and why his career has sort of often been seen in the shadow of Francis Bacon's, is that Sutherland was able to take these many different facets of his art and somehow synthesize them. Every chapter of his life seemed to feed and inform the next. And so when we look on this back wall, for example, we've got a kind of encapsulation of what Sutherland was about. We've got this thorn cross, strange biomorphic form here that's almost like a tree that's twisted into strange insect-like shapes. We've got things that almost look like pupae leaving or larvae leaving a cocoon, or we've got these sort of writhing forms that capture something of the strange passions, the agonies, the inner torment that he might have felt as a converted Catholic. We've got monumental forms like these that sort of have all the heft and the presence of a piece of sculpture, something like a Henry Moore sculpture from the same time period, that have something of the presence of his portrait painting. You can see the way that Sutherland took his experiences during the war, looking at blast furnaces, looking at steelworks, how he took that world of flame and heat and intense work and transported it to the outside world, to the sort of cathedral of the countryside in monumental scenes of sunsets like this, or of these sort of strange plant-like forms, scenes of the undergrowth where we're never quite sure what the scale is, whether we're looking at something that is huge or something that's minute, and where this world of growth and undergrowth, this tangle of thorns, is tongued with this beautiful sense of fire. It is this world of life on its smallest and at its largest scales that Sutherland really found his inspiration, found his source for his work. And it's a world which I'm always made aware of at this time of year. A couple of years ago, we sowed our garden with wildflower seed, and since then, during this sort of the cold winter and autumn months, this plot that lays fairly dormant suddenly springs to life at late spring, early summer. Tendrils of these wildflowers sort of spring up, they burst forth, they're almost like flames, that suddenly have this great exponential burst of energy to them. And what was once a fairly quiet plot of land suddenly becomes bursting with activity, with the activity of small insects moving around, this thrum of life growing around us. It's something that my children are drawn to immensely. There are no descriptions of Sutherland's childhood like that in his biography by Roger Berthoud, but I'd like to imagine that Sutherland was the kind of boy who would have had his nose pressed up against the grass, who would have got his fingernails dirty looking in the undergrowth. In his fractious household, where his parents often round, I like to think he would have been out in the garden, spending his time out in the outside. His mother was an adept gardener. I like to imagine him with a butterfly net. His trajectory as an artist was not anticipated. He almost fell into art by accident. A brief time training as an engineer fell through, and he eventually persuaded his parents that he'd like to go and study art. And it was at Goldsmith's School of Art that he first learnt the rudiments of etching and engraving. In the 1920s, he became a master of these mediums. He became a romantic artist in the vein of Samuel Palmer. He sort of resurrected the world of the ancients of William Blake and Palmer in portraits of sluice gates and small farmhouses. It was only really in the 1930s, when the market for those prints died with the economic downturn that the world was experiencing, that as Sutherland turned to commercial work, as he began to paint seriously for himself, that a really independent voice started to emerge, a voice that saw the natural world in its moments of growth, of birth, of decay, of resurrection, as sort of mimicking, holding a reflection to the worlds of faith, of creativity. He sort of saw an awful lot of the things that he was interested in reflected within that world. We've got some very early prints here from the 1940s and 50s, really at a time when Britain had just accepted him as its prominent artist, its saviour of British art of the late 1930s, early 1940s. And they show some of that individual language coming through. He was a very linear artist. He was a graphics man. He liked to draw. The strength of the line in his etching work followed through into his painting, into his lithography, into the other forms of printmaking. And you can see that in some of these images here. But there's something about the way that Sutherland could look at the world around him, at fairly ordinary, everyday forms, things like these scenes from a maize field, or strange sort of tree branches, roots in the undergrowth, or the great swathes of hills, particularly in Wales, or along the coastline of Pembrokeshire, which became his sort of haunting place. Something about the translation that he made from that world into this strange private language of poetic forms that's really very moving. He was an artist who couldn't work immediately on the spot. He had to take sketches. He worked very sort of anxiously, hesitantly in a sketchbook, and took those experiences back with him to the studio. And it was only in the studio, once he was sort of within the confines of that room, alone with his thoughts, that what he'd first seen, what had first drawn his eye and captured his imagination, found its voice, began to develop into the final images that we see in prints like these. If the 1940s was a time when Sutherland was hugely feted, when he became the major British artist of his generation, when he was allotted a place on the Tate board, this was also a time when his career started to meet its controversies, to face some difficulties. And very quickly he found the British art establishment closed in on it. It was in the 1950s that quite an anxious man, quite a man very easily swayed, very impressionable, he didn't take well to criticism, and he found that sort of entrapment difficult to deal with. And so it was in the 1950s that he and his wife retreated from Britain to the south of France to a house in Menton. And it was during that period that most of this work was produced. I think there's a wonderful ambiguity to everything that Sutherland did. He seemed to be able to strike this strange chord that is very sure and sort of hieratic and powerful on the one hand, and also ambivalent and private and cloistered and strange on the other. And so you can get from sort of commercial work, things like this powerful portrait of a ram's head designed for an Italian mill, a Zegna, which has all of the strength, all of the sort of captured moment of his best portrait work. And then you also have these unusual forms that have been sort of abstracted from the natural world of eggs, of animals, of beasts, of writhing plants and roots in the undergrowth. And they have something a little bit hidden and undecipherable about them. There is something sort of cryptic to them that I think captures the relationship that Sutherland had with his art, of this thing where he was never quite sure where he was going with something, where an idea would take him, never quite sure if it met its moment of completion, of fruition. And that strange, twisting, undulating, growing, emerging feeling that you get in some of these prints was sort of reflective of his creative process, of images that sort of percolated in the brain, found their way on the paper, and of which he was never quite sure. Before his career as a young man in art took off, I think Sutherland was convinced by his father that he ought to try studying as an engineer. And so for a brief period of time he worked in Derby. And he had an important experience during that time. He found he was not particularly adept at the work. He was asked, because he was tall and rather slim, to clamber inside the boiler of a shunting engine to inspect it from the inside. And after climbing in, found that he couldn't work his way out of it again. He was stuck there for quite some time. And the anxiety of this enclosed space, of the heat, the claustrophobia, was something that never left him. He was claustrophobic, he was agoraphobic for the rest of his life. And it meant that, as a converted Catholic, he often found that he was unable to spend time within the church buildings itself, and instead found his sort of communion with God out in the natural world. Without wanting to read too much into biographical experiences into his art, I think something of that enclosure, of that enclosed space, something of that anxiety and that need for exploring the outside world is captured in his art. Often we get images like these of insects or of animals that have this kind of hemmed-in quality. There's something about this sort of this private world that's going on that we're not witness to, this strangeness that we can't quite see what's going on, can't quite make out what's there. There are elements of the kind of the fire and the heat of that time that are captured in his images of rock forms, of roots, of trees and of water. Even the strangeness of some of his animals in these late bestiaries of the 60s and 70s. There is something of that sort of contorted, writhing form, that discomfort that he experienced early on, and which has been sort of perhaps reworked in his mind and transposed to the work that he was working on later in his career. It was actually this kind of experience that he made clear both in public interviews and also in private correspondence and in the notes of his sketchbooks. And I'd like to read you a couple of those now. Some of them were first published in our Unseen Sutherland exhibition in 2006, which showcased some sketchbook works. The first is one of very few childhood recollections that was recounted in an interview and cited in the biography of Graham Sutherland's work. Sutherland says, "The quality which I felt when I was about 10 of being in a wood, or at the side of a river, the warmth of the summer sun, was a thing which still stays with me, and I get enormously moved by this curious quality of enclosure, of being inside, as it were, a jewel, in a way which a sunlit landscape seems to have." This feeling of oneness with the place, with the time, with the environment around him, which he felt he had to somehow capture in his sketchbook work, somehow bring that flame into his studio, was something he then spoke about much later in his life. Again, a note from his sketchbook. "All in all, I look on the hidden places where I work as a marvellous playground. My estuaries as great salons, where I'm alone to encounter the personages I find. And in these places, once I'm lost in work, I have a horror of being disturbed. If I could, I would barricade myself in with a ring of rocks." The last 2 decades of Sutherland's life, the last 2 decades of his work, were hugely ambitious. I think in the same way that in the countryside he found a kind of a rejuvenation, a sense of renewed spirit in the work that the undergrowth that he saw around him. Similarly, when he came to Nice, to the sort of French-Italian border in these last decades of his life, there was a similar kind of rejuvenation to his work. He returned to printmaking really with a great passion, and we get some of the great series from those later years, things like the Bestiaries, the Apollinaire series, the Bee Aquatints. They're hugely ambitious works. They're delightfully graphic. They understand the printed image as a kind of encapsulation of a particular kind of medium. So we get these wonderful bursts of colour, this great big flat colour in this green, which seems to be Sutherland's own. There's some kind of quality about this green that recurs again and again in his images, which captures something about his work. He found in subjects like insects, like animals, like we've got this fantastic character of this bat here, he found he had that wonderful combination of precise articulation of mobility and mechanics that he'd seen in his wall work, looking in the steel foundries, the furnaces, and also of biomorphic form, of living things, of living spirits. And there's a kind of wonderful darkness, a kind of thorny, spiky, gothic quality to some of these that showcases his references to artists like Grunewald, to Dürer, who also were artists who looked at the undergrowth, looked at animals in great detail. I think they also show an understanding of printmaking as a traditional way of producing images, one that has a history to it and one where that history is always evident. This is one of my favourite pieces in the exhibition. It's this magnificent totemic form of I think a larvae here, or a pupae, perhaps for a bee or some other kind of insect. And it's typical Sutherland. We get this writhing form, we get these great big proud standing monumental shapes that feel like sort of stone totems or trees. But it also reminds me of a kind of a drop cap, an illuminated capital letter in an old manuscript of the kind that we get in medieval and Renaissance literature. This beautiful sort of ornate working to a large design. It's a huge etching plate, one that would have required great knowledge of how to use the press, the equal pressure across the plate to get this beautiful colour evenly printed. And it showcases that Sutherland was still, in these late years, really thinking in a printmaker's terms, really understanding the translation of an image into the particular medium, whether it was etching or lithography. The great theme of Sutherland's art from the 1930s, when he first discovered that very personal voice, right through to the very last works of his life, was that of transformation and metamorphosis. He would go for a walk in the countryside, down a road, out into the open world, into the sunken world of the undergrowth of an estuary in Pembrokeshire. He would look around him and he would register certain details, certain aspects of the world around him. And at some point between that first experience, between the sketching that took place, between the working up in the studio, between the work at the printmakers and the atelier, a transformation over a slow period of time would take place. And the essence of that experience would be translated somehow into the final work. I think Sutherland's understanding of the natural world as an ancient and primordial place, as a violent place often, was tied directly as well to his faith in a sacrificial God. It was a sacrifice that he knew well when, in 1929, his first son, John, died just 3 months after his wife, Kathleen, had given birth. Every day thereafter, when Sutherland walked in the countryside, he saw a world of death and of rebirth, of resurrection around him. And I think he transposed that world into his art. Eventually, in 1990, that world of organic growth took him too when he died of cancer in his liver. But in the best work that he left behind him, in the prints that we've seen here today for the last 20 or 30 years of his life, he somehow captured something of that infinite mystery, that strangeness, that divine quality that he saw in the world around him, that he saw reflected in the landscape at large, but also in its tiniest, its most minute details. I hope you've enjoyed seeing some of these prints, maybe images that you were familiar with and some that you'd never seen before. It's a fantastic show. Do please come and visit us, come and see them for yourselves. And don't forget to check out our new Coventry Cathedral print. I look forward to seeing you again here at the gallery soon.